Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to the book talk on the new Goliath. This event is hosted jointly by LMU's Institute for Strategy, Technology, and Organization and NYU's Center for the Future of Management. I'm Rob Siemens. I'm a professor here at NYU, and my collaborator will introduce himself in just a moment. These events are held semi-regularly, and we'll mention about our next panel at the end of today's event. Today, we are excited to host Jim Bessen of Boston University. Jim will discuss his new book, The New Goliath. Here's the format. We'll start with a brief introduction of Jim. Then we will turn things over to Jim, who will present some slides explaining the thesis of his book. Then we'll jump into a moderated discussion. And then after that, we'll take audience questions. One programming note, please use the Zoom Q&A feature to enter in any questions that you might have, and we'll get to as many of these as we can. Toby, over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks very much. And also welcome from my side. My name's Toby Kretschmer. I'm a professor at LMU's School of Management. So today's speaker is James Bessen. James is an economist and technologist, and he serves as the executive director of the Technology and Policy Research Initiative at Boston University. He also has been a successful innovator and CEO of a software company. Bessen studies the major economic impacts of technology on society, writing academic papers, magazine articles, and books. And his latest book, which we're going to discuss today, The New Goliaths, argues that major firms' investments in proprietary software systems have allowed them to increase their dominance of industries, which slows down aggregate innovation and raises income inequality. James's work has been widely cited in the press, as well as by the US White House and Supreme Court, the European Parliament, and the Federal Trade Commission. Jim, we're super excited to have you with us today.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me. So I'm going to show some slides. Let me share screen here. Okay. So the general theme is about what's the role of technology in the economy. And in the 1990s, it was very popular to talk about the new economy, this idea that new digital technology, because computers were cheap and getting cheaper all the time, and software was inexpensive and widely accessible, that this would level the playing field, that small, one or two person companies could gain access to tools that were previously only available to large companies, and they could compete much more effectively. Plus, with greater communication capabilities, there was the so-called death of distance. They could contract with people around the world. Companies could focus on their core competencies and outsource all the non-core activities. And because there was just such a great access to this technology, there would be a lot more innovation, which would disrupt the incumbents. These little firms would grow and eventually displace entrenched incumbent firms that were using old technology. It didn't turn out quite that way. And I'm going to argue instead that what we're seeing now is a growing dominance of the large firms, declining disruption of those firms, a slower growth rates for the innovative firms, and less diffusion or spread of technology through society. And this all leads to or points to a slower productivity growth. And the key thing is that it is adoption of some key technologies by major firms that is a significant factor in this development. All right, so look at one technology you're all familiar with, the barcode scanner. It was introduced into retail in the US in the 1970s. Initially, it was most widely adopted by small firms, very much in the new economy setting. So small retailers or mid-sized retailers were the early adopters of this. They could use it to gain efficiencies in their workplace, and there were increases in revenue and decreases in prices, and it provided a competitive advantage to them. Walmart was, at that point, not a very large firm. It took that technology, though, and paired it with a whole set of other technologies and a whole different organizational structure. So rather than just looking at this technology on a store-by-store basis, Walmart built the system where they had the first private satellite system in the US information from the cash registers was collected and it was beamed around to central headquarters, but also to suppliers. And all the different parties could interact to a point where suppliers or store managers could see how different products were doing in each particular store, perhaps making adjustments, perhaps refilling stock more rapidly than they were expecting, and making themselves more responsive. So this was an inversion of the typical chain store model, which the idea was there would be a central headquarters which would gain efficiencies by centralizing decision-making. So the buyers from headquarters would buy things from the suppliers, they would be shipped to central warehouses and then out to the stores, and it was in control of the the central headquarters, which gained them efficiencies, but it also reduced their ability to respond. Every store had the same package of goods pretty much, and the response, the selection of goods was limited in order to make that happen. Everything was very standardized. So Walmart changed that. It introduced this very flexible information flow, and it built an organization that could take advantage of it. And as a result, Walmart was able to, number one, stock many more items in each store, much greater selection, which was much more attractive to consumers. They could do one-stop shopping. They became much more responsive to changes in demand and to local variations in demand. And in part, the stores could be replenished more frequently. Because of their efficiencies in organizing this, they reduced their warehousing costs, which enabled them to lower prices and pursue a everyday low price strategy. And so they gained the advantage of efficiency that a large store could have, but they also provided a much greater degree of addressing consumers' heterogeneous needs. And this was a very successful formula. They grew from 3% of the general merchandise retail market in the US in 1982 to 52% just 30 years later. So what is it that information technology does? The modularity of software reduces the cost of complexity. It enables retailers to have much greater variety in their stores, much greater selection. It allows products to be built with many more features. It allows targeting or customization of advertising or of financial offers, credit card offers. So it allows, in these cases, firms to both be highly efficient and also to address heterogeneous consumer needs much better than they could under a standardized mass production type economy. And so this wasn't just retail. So Walmart and Amazon, were able to have much better logistics and inventory, better selection and response, but it's also manufacturing where software became an essential part of the design of products, but also of the products themselves. So that made things more expensive. They made things more software-based. An automobile cost $5 or $6 billion to design from scratch, and it may involve 100 million lines of software code and perhaps as many as 100 computers. It allowed targeted advertising. We're familiar with Google and Facebook. It allowed lots of other targeting, though, so banks can tailor credit cards to individual consumers and market to them, and so they can manage their risk much better and provide consumers with offers that are more tailored to their needs or interests. So there's this notion that software is enabling firms to compete on complexity. I want to emphasize it's not just about big tech. It's through much of the economy. I estimate something like 45% of industries and almost over 2/3 of all revenue is affected by industries where the market leaders are using these technologies. There's been a huge surge in investment in proprietary software and customized software. This tends to be very heavily dominated by large firms. Most of the software developers are employed at large firms outside of the computer and software industries. So what is the impact of this change? One is it's related to growing concentration. The top firms in each industry are growing their market shares at the expense of everybody else. This research relates this to the software intensity of the workforce. So the more software workers, the larger the share of software workers in the workforce of a firm or an industry, the greater the market share of the top four firms in that industry. And this has been shown to be a causal relationship. In other words, the investments in software are helping to increase the market shares of the top firms. It means declining disruption. So this shows, we tend to think since Clayton Christensen that industry is very disruptive and technology is one of the most disruptive forces. But in fact, for the last 20 years, disruption has been declining. This shows the probability that a firm that was in the top four of its industry 4 years ago is no longer in the top four. And so that disruption rate peaked in the late 90s when Christensen wrote his book, and it's been declining pretty much ever since. The flip side of that is there's less probability that a smaller firm can leapfrog into the top four. That's also declined. And again, software can explain much of that decline. What about innovation? We tend to think of innovation being a disruptive force. There has, in fact, there's some people argue, and we can talk about this later maybe, that there's a shortage of new ideas, or it's becoming more difficult to develop new ideas. At least in terms of startups, the number of startups has not declined significantly, both tech startups or general startups. But what's different is the growth of the startups. So what we're seeing is that innovative startups are growing more slowly. This is why there's less disruption. It also has a very significant impact on aggregate productivity growth. It turns out that an important part of the Schumpeterian story is that productive firms will grow faster and eventually overtake the large firms. But if they're growing more slowly, it turns out that they contribute less to the aggregate growth and productivity. And this has been shown to be responsible for the so-called productivity slowdown. We can see this in one measure, and there are a number of others that show the effect. But just it takes startups longer to achieve their milestones. So we're in 2006. The time from founding to seed financing was 0.9 years. It's now more like 2.5 years. The time from first funding to exit, meaning acquisition or public offering, was 2 years, and now it's 6 years. So things are going much more slowly. Related to that is what economists at the OECD have called a productivity gap. It used to be that the top firms were had roughly the same productivity, meaning in this case just revenue per employee, as smaller firms. But starting around 2000, when these trends kicked in, there is a widening gap between the top firms in each market and the rest of them, that the top firms tend to be significantly more productive. The explanation for this is that there is slower diffusion. So typically with a new technology, it gets offered to other players. It spreads throughout the economy because the owners of the technology license it, or other firms are able to invent around the owners' patents, or alternative technologies develop that do similar things. In the book, I talk about the automatic transmission. General Motors developed it, and within 10 years, all of its major competitors had automatic transmissions. Now we're seeing slower diffusion, and that means more limited access to the best technologies, especially for those smaller productive firms. So, the conclusion is we are seeing a new economy. It's just a very different one than people were talking about in the late 90s. Software is changing the nature of competition, and this pattern leads to growing industry concentration, less disruption, less diffusion, and slower productivity growth. So that should help start a conversation here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Jim. Those were great thoughts. Here I was studying the new economy for like 20 something years, and now you're telling us about the new economy.
Right.
Now, a lot of the examples basically were US specific. And so, coming from Germany, coming from a German institution, I wonder if this is actually a US specific problem, or do you think we see similar issues in other countries? And in particular, I'd be interested in your thoughts about Germany.
Right. So I can't claim to be an expert on Germany or the rest of the world generally, but we see some pieces of evidence that this certainly seems to be the case. And most notably, the researcher, Chiara Criscuolo and her researchers at the OECD have done a number of studies. They show that industry concentration is rising in Europe and elsewhere. They show that the rise in markups is related to information technology. And we're seeing, we're seeing some of the same technologies and the same approaches being used by major European companies. SAP is producing some key components of the systems that other companies use to build these things. And if you look at Volkswagen, it is certainly, its cars are very much based on software, including some of its suppliers like Bosch. It's very much part. The technology is clearly very similar. It has similar effects. I think it probably plays out a little differently because of the nature of markets. U.S. has, one market, and in Europe, things are still more fragmented despite having a common market. But I think it's for real, but it's certainly an open research question to understand how it's playing out.
Cool. Thanks,
Jim. I want to. So first of all, thank you for the very clear and fascinating presentation. I'm going to go off script already, right? So we already have some questions that that we will get to. But as I was listening to your presentation, you kept coming back to this point around the year 2000, and so why, like, what happened there? Why is that so important? And I get that we had, I know some of the things that happened there in terms of .com and whatnot, bubble and everything, but why 2000? Why not 99? Why not 2003?
So,
was there something special there?
Yeah, it's that's ends up just being the average. So we actually did. We looked at, we have this chart of the disruption, where it's going up until some like the late 90s, and then it starts going down, and so it's a distinct peak. So we actually looked at individual industries, and it turns out, well, first off, some industries don't show the pattern. Most do, but we're seeing some earlier, some later. In retail, it happened earlier. In other industries, I think finance later. So it's not a single event. It's not the .com boom or something like that. But I think it's, you look at what these systems are and the scale. Walmart was building their system for a long time. I mean, they began in the 80s. And it wasn't until the early to mid 90s that they really had a lot of steam and were, growing very rapidly as a result of it. So these are big, complex systems. They're new types of organizations. They're platforms. And so all of those are long things that take a long time to develop. So I think it's sort of natural that they're going to occur in some unison, but it's spread out over a very long time frame. And I think the thing we track is you just look at the levels of investments that large firms have made in software or intangibles generally, and these start surging in the late 90s and early 2000s. And that marks, to me, marks the difference.
Okay. Let me. Thanks for that explanation. One quick. I'm going to come back to my original question in just a moment. One quick programming note. We're already starting to get some questions coming in. That's great. Just a reminder to the audience. You can type in your questions to us via the question and answer feature on Zoom. We're not going to call on people live, but we meaning Toby, Jim, and myself, we see the questions, and we will come to some of those questions shortly. They've been coming in quicker than they've ever come before, but keep them coming. Jim, let me come to what originally was going to be my question. So you mentioned in passing about entrepreneurship, but you didn't have any slide that was specifically devoted, let's say, to entrepreneurship or business dynamism. And I wanted to bring it up because our last speakers were Karen Mills and Javi Miranda. We spent a lot of time talking about trends in entrepreneurship and business dynamism. And there were some interesting points that came up. So one of the points that comes up is we know over the long sweep of at least the U.S. history, going back 40 years or so, that business dynamism has declined, right? There's less entry now as a function of total number of firms than there used to be. So that feels like that's part of the story here, right? That there's some sort of friction that's maybe preventing firms from entering in the first place. You mentioned maybe some friction in terms of the growth, but can you talk also a little bit about whether that's another margin, right? The sort of frictions in terms of entry?
Right. So I did show a slide that showed the number of firms entering, and I pointed out that the number of firms entering hasn't gone down. If you want, I can bring that slide back if it's helpful. Why don't I just share that?
Let's do it.
Yeah, I'll just share that for a second. So the dark line here shows the number of new tech firms in the U.S., the dashed line, the number of all new firms. And you see tech firms in particular were rising in the 80s and 90s. This was the dot-com boom. They peaked. They've come down a little from the peak, but they haven't really declined since then. What has declined, and this was the number you cited, and this is why I think it's a little bit confusing. If you look at the number of new firms or young firms that are 5 years old or less, as a share of the total firms, or if you look at the employment of young firms as a share of total employment, that has gone down over a long period of time. But so if you put together the chart I have where the number of new firms is stable or roughly stable, what this really means is that new firms are lasting longer. They're getting older. So that, a firm that might have typically exited by year 5 is now lasting to year 6 or 7. And for that reason, we're seeing more older firms. That relates to what I think is the key point. So people talk about business dynamism, they mean a number of different things. The key thing that I think is driving this is that productive firms, new firms, are growing more slowly. It's a critical thing. A lot of researchers focus on entrepreneurship and innovation, and they just focus on, creating new ideas. We want to get to the point of creating a new firm, coming up with, an invention or a new way of doing business that a new firm can take. And what this is saying is the loss in dynamism really comes after that point. And that's a more difficult problem to think about. So you can think about creating new ideas, and we have R&D incentives, and we have policies that can encourage new firms to enter. But you have to think a little bit harder when it comes to answering the question: how do we make it so that these firms don't grow, grow more rapidly? How do we make it so they do grow more rapidly? And we need to understand why they're not growing rapidly. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think that's sort of where the key challenge is.
Yeah, you definitely have, and I think it's actually these points are related to some of the questions that we're getting. So let me turn it over to Toby, who can turn to the.
Yes, fantastic. There's been a question by Zur Shapira, who's asking: has there been a growth in employment of hiring high-tech personnel in large firms in recent years?
Absolutely, yes, yeah. And you're seeing. So in the book, I talk about the labor market effects. I didn't give them in the talk, but what you're seeing is almost a segregation of the labor market where the top firms who have the technology are paying more, they're hiring more highly skilled people, they're paying more for the same jobs, substantially more. And so there's almost a two-tier labor market emerging.
Excellent. There's a kind of also related question by Cameron Rabineau, Has high employee turnover been a factor in this productivity differential? The larger the labor force, the more flexible a business can be in adapting to turnover. Further, large companies have the economies of scale to provide better benefits to facilitate retention.
Yeah, it's a tricky question. There are a lot of things going on there. So there have been changes in mobility and turnover. To some extent, surprisingly, job tenure has actually increased. I think I'm right about this. That definitely goes against sort of the public notion that, you'd work for a company like IBM and you could stay there your whole career, and now everything's a free-for-all. It turns out that, well, COVID probably changes everything, but at least prior to COVID, job tenure actually had been increasing. I think probably what's more critical in terms of building or encouraging the growth of innovative startups is employee mobility. So, you want to have tech employees who have experience with new technologies being able to move to a startup, or you want startups to be able to, to hire the top talent. And what we've seen, and this I think is a serious policy problem and a significant contributor to the slowdown, we've seen lower mobility, both in terms of people changing jobs, in terms of people changing occupations, in terms of people moving to new locations. That makes it more difficult. And we see some policy reasons why that is happening. There's now some pretty good evidence that employee non-compete agreements have slowed down the creation of startups and the growth of startups and made it more difficult. We're seeing changes in trade secret law that have a similar effect.
Jim, thank you, by the way, for starting to talk about some of the policy issues here. And we'll definitely dive into that in a little bit more detail soon. There are a few other questions that are coming in that I think are related to this current discussion. So one is from J.K. Suh. He asks, can the longer exit times for startups be a result of experimentation costs dropping? And he here is citing work by Ewens, Nanda, Rhodes, Kropf in a 2018 paper that's talking about the introduction of AWS, right? So basically the cloud. So can the longer exit times for startups be a result of experimentation costs dropping and therefore worse startups entering the risk set as a result of this cost drop?
Yeah, well, so the argument seems to be specifically about the contention seems to be that maybe we're just seeing lower quality startups. I think is that one way of interpreting the scenario without going into the details of it.
Yeah, I think that sounds right.
Yeah. And I think that's a possibility, but there's been some work by Scott Stern where they've sort of tried to, what they do is they try to identify high quality startups and see how they've done. And Scott, and I'm blanking on the name of his co-author, sorry, but their conclusion was we're seeing just as many high quality startups, but they're growing more slowly. They're not, they're getting to exit more slowly.
Jorge Guzman.
That's right. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Christina. We'll turn to yet another question. First of all, everybody, thank you for the questions. Keep them coming. We'll get to as many of these as we can. Okay, here's Derek Oskal from Kauffman Foundation.
Hi, Derek.
Though Y2K was mostly a non-event, my understanding is that the years preceding it likely led to somewhat significant software investments for large firms. This somewhat forced investment may have had the unintended consequence of letting large firms see the value in customized software investments. Any thoughts on if this helps explain some of the timing, or was this effect too small?
Yeah, well, I just think I don't really know. Let me first say that, but I'll give you my my gut reaction, which is the Y2K. So the Y2K stuff was mostly about patching up old legacy systems. These new systems are built from the ground up. So it's possible Y2K may have encouraged firms to say it's time to chuck the old legacy systems. I'm not sure though that's what happened, and I tend to think that the big systems that have built and become successful, first off, many of them started well before the year 2000, and they really began with a very different vision of what role software could play, of how companies could build platforms, whether internal or external, and that was much more the driving factor.
Okay, Jim, we're also apart from everything else, we're also here to talk about your book. So let's get back to that. So let's say that we believe everything that you've laid out in the slides that you gave us. So basically, what we see seems like a big problem, right? And so, in terms of the policies, or in terms of the potential policies, what do we do about this? Does your book discuss any potential solutions, or do you have any others?
Yeah, I'm not. These are potential and partial solutions, and I should say, I don't think I know the answer. I think it's going to take us I think this problem is going to be with us a long time, and it's going to take us a long time to figure out what to do about it. Let me start by saying that to some extent, I'm seeing some movement by firms themselves to do things that remedy the problem to some extent. So we talked about the cloud. Some firms, so you know what these large companies have done is build platforms, and these are largely internal platforms that they use for their own good. What some firms have started doing is opening up their platforms, and AWS, the Amazon Web Services, is an example of that. So Amazon realized in the early 2000s that it had a significant competitive advantage because of its IT capabilities. Running a huge website with lots of traffic that's highly variable all over the world, it turns out to be a big headache for IT managers. They developed a system that could deal with it, and they decided in, I believe it was 2006, that rather than just keep this as a proprietary advantage of their own, they would open it up and make it available for a fee. And that became Amazon Web Services, AWS, and that initiated the cloud industry. It's clear Amazon makes a lot of money from this, but it also makes advanced technology accessible to even tiny companies. The more that we see companies choosing open platform strategies, I think the more this problem recedes. It does create open platforms, I think it's pretty clear, create a new set of headaches for antitrust regulators because it's very hard to see what's going on, to understand what's going on. There are new opportunities to abuse power. And so there's a downside to that movement. But I think ultimately, the core problem is that these are technologies that are not spread throughout society. If they were spread more widely or were more widely accessible, most of the problems would go away. So that said, the kind of formal policies that may encourage that movement. So one are policies that encourage employee mobility. And so I talked about that a few minutes ago. The sad story here is policy has largely been moving in the wrong direction over the last 10 or 20 years, making it more difficult for employees to, particularly technical employees, to switch jobs. The other side of it, though, is I think antitrust enforcers have also played a role in the past in encouraging the diffusion of technology. So in the book, I cite a couple examples. One was the consent decree where Bell Labs was forced to license its semiconductor technology. that essentially created the semiconductor industry. IBM was forced to unbundle software from its hardware. They used to sell them both together, and what that meant was that competitors to IBM who lacked the software capabilities couldn't compete as effectively. IBM unbundled as a result of threats from the Justice Department, and that essentially created the modern independent software industry. And it also proved, very profitable to IBM. So it happens all the time that antitrust authorities are reviewing mergers and acquisitions or dealing with litigation. And as part of their settlements, they've often imposed compulsory licensing of technology or of patents. I think the logical next step, and it would seem to be certainly within their scope, is to think more broadly about the role of technologies and the extent to which these new technologies are providing a substantial degree of market power, and think about licensing data or encouraging access to open platforms, so that antitrust authorities could actually play a significant role in opening up some of these platforms.
Fantastic.
Toby, sorry, I'm again going off script. I just, on that very last statement, I just wanted to jump in, Jim. So in terms of opening up data, so do you have in mind here things like data portability and or interoperability?
Absolutely, yeah. So we see in the financial industry, banking, we have all of these fintech companies who have had difficulty getting access to, letting consumers get access to their own data, right? So my bank has all my transaction data, and they're able to use that to sell me credit cards, home equity lines, all sorts of stuff, right? We have fintech companies coming along who have new ideas about maybe they can combine data from different companies and give me a more complete picture of my, financial situation or whatever, and manage things differently, or who knows what. A lot of innovative ideas. But in the US in particular, banks have been very resistant to letting consumers transfer their data to a fintech company. Originally, they did it by web scraping. Now some of them are offering APIs. It's still a difficult and tedious process. In Europe and some Far Eastern countries, governments have played a more active role in opening up that data, making it more portable, and it seems to be having a positive effect on fintech innovation.
Okay, cool. Thanks very much. And I'd like to kind of hone in a bit more on the issue of market power, especially given that one other talk that we had in the past was by John Van Reenen and Tommaso Valletti on superstar firms. And one point that we pressed John and Tommaso on was whether superstar firms are good or bad for innovation on balance. And they agreed a bit too much for a taste, but their overall sentiment was that I'd say a qualified positive. And it'd be really interesting to hear your take on that.
Yeah, so it's clear that they are both good and bad, right? So number one, these firms have only succeeded because they're delivering to consumers, much more effectively. They're providing consumers with things that are beneficial to consumers. Now, sometimes that might not be beneficial to society overall. To some extent, these systems may allow one large firm to simply take business from other firms, right? So that doesn't necessarily, they may be more responsive to consumers, but that doesn't necessarily help the overall, social situation in terms of welfare. But I think overall, probably these systems are delivering important new value. The problem comes in the extent to which they're responsible for the slowdown in the growth of new productive firms. And, so that's, in my mind, clearly a negative. I think probably to the extent that productivity is not mismeasured, which I think is an important question. The fact that it's the slowdown in the growth of small companies, small innovative companies seems to be responsible for a substantial part of the slowdown in aggregate productivity. That says to me the net effect of these large companies is probably not positive. I think it's very hard to tell. But the key policy solution, we're not here about, we're not so much concerned with labeling who's good and who's bad. Everybody's a little of both. But it's thinking about the policies that will sort of take the advantages that these large companies have developed, make them more widely available, and that will benefit society as a whole on the one hand, and also enable a greater competition and faster growth for our most innovative firms.
Perfect. Thanks, Jim. That's great.
Jim, I want to turn back to some of the audience questions. A common theme that has come up with some of the audience questions is around the role of AI. Okay, so I'm going to read out loud two questions, and then I'll just try to briefly summarize them. Okay, in a succinct way. So here's the first question from Eduardo Herrera. NVIDIA CEO is saying, software is eating the world, and now AI is eating software. This, I guess, will compound the issue. However, there are startups in AI. Might it turn around the tables? Roel Sanchez writes, I'm kind of puzzled with the results. Wouldn't efforts along the lines of AI support disruption, e.g. Alexa, Siri, Google Translate, etc.? Or does the speaker mean to say that disruption is more controlled these days by algorithms? Therefore, our need to rationalize our thoughts with data before trying something new. So just to summarize what I think the two comments are getting after is, what about AI? One could see AI as sort of exacerbating these issues that you've laid out, but on the other hand, maybe especially startups using AI might be able to address some of the issues. And so what's your thought on this, and how do you come down on that?
Right. So first off, I want to emphasize that while software is the key enabling ingredient of these systems, it's important to understand that the systems themselves are much more than software. They are organizations, they are hardware, they are data. So a startup may come up with some very innovative AI, and it faces a tough road in terms of being able to pull in those other pieces. In the book, I write about Nuance Software, which was the leading voice recognition software company. They had Dragon Dictation and a number of other apps. And at one point, all of the big tech companies were using them in some way. They created the original platform for Siri, and their dictation apps were on the iPhone and Android phones. What happened was that at around 2013 or so, the early 2010s, the big firms realized that voice was going to be a major part of the operating system, more or less. And so they wanted to be able to use voice, not just to do dictation, but to control computers and control all sorts of interactions people would have with computers, select music, go shopping, whatever. They were able to leverage their bases, in other words, Google has, a tremendous amount of data coming in from search. A lot of that search is over voice. And so Google was able to train its voice. These systems were all AI at that point. Google was, had a much bigger base to train its voice systems to recognize all sorts of commands because it had a much greater, richer source. And similarly, Alexa was providing Amazon with a much richer base. So what this eventually meant was that Nuance was forced to specialize into more narrow niche areas such as health dictation, and it was eventually, basically, its growth it had been growing rapidly. It stopped growing around 2013, and I guess last year was purchased by Microsoft. So it wasn't a sad outcome for Nuance necessarily, but what you see is that there are big limits to how much a startup can grow if it's facing rivals who have much more superior complementary resources. And I think that's That's the idea with a lot of these systems. So whether it's AI or just traditional software, doesn't really matter, I don't think. It's the platform that matters and their ability to build a comprehensive platform.
Jim, so your answer, in some ways, I mean, it reminds me of the Walmart example that you start out with, that I think is a beautiful example, right? And your point there, at least one of the points, is it's not just technology; it's the technology together with this sort of business organization innovation that together benefited Walmart. So this is very closely related to a question that Christina McElhern just raised. So I'll read it out loud. She writes, how do we diffuse the organizational complements more widely? My take is that it's not just tech, but the tech plus org, and that seems much harder to spread around. Any ideas to promote young firm capacity to leverage software?
Boy, that's a good question, and I'm not sure I have much of an answer. I mean, we do see management practices being spread around. Obviously, management schools can play a role in that. One for the home team, right? But it's not an easy problem, and it's another one of these problems that I think is going to take a long time to solve. How do you train people to handle these complex systems, especially when they may not easily get access to them? So, I mean, we're seeing that access to the systems is in fact something that key management and technical employees recognize. Sunny Tambe and Peter Capelli did an interesting study where they found that employees were willing to take job applicants were willing to take a pay cut in order to gain access to the latest technology related to AI. They were later able to recoup that by being able to command higher pay at their next job. But there's this very much a big challenge of learning by doing in terms of being able to spread the knowledge. This is something I studied in the 19th century in my previous book. But it was very much, you had these new factories and they hadn't, where do you find somebody who knows how to manage them? And so it turns out that it was almost like one economic historian did like a family tree, of people who worked at this shop and then spread to other shops and then spread to other shops. It was a very, but that implies a rather slow transition. We can probably do better than that, but yeah, I mean, we have to think about ways to encourage employee mobility helps, but to encourage learning by doing and better training in schools that is more experience-based.
So Jim, one more question. So maybe it's about the timing. So we've been talking about what could happen in the future with increasing use of AI and different policies we could implement. I'm wondering if we actually are already seeing some of the things we have been discussing. So one development that is clearly in everyone's timeline these days are the recent troubles that Twitter and Meta have been going through, including massive layoffs. So my question would be if those massive layoffs should be taken as a sign that big tech as we know it is already declining, and if so, will there be a new small group of firms running the show in a couple of years? So if you gave that talk, 5 years from now or 10 years from now, would we be talking about the same structure but with exchanged names, or is there something that is different?
Yeah. So first off, I think neither Meta nor Twitter are really examples of what I'm talking about much. Well, maybe Facebook was, but both. It's very clear that Meta and Twitter have their own distinctive problems. Most of what I'm talking about, is the big economy. It's not just about big tech. Mm-hmm. And sure, we're seeing layoffs at Amazon also. I don't think Amazon's going to be displaced anytime soon. I don't think Walmart's going to be displaced anytime soon. I mean, it's shocking to think about tech layoffs because we just haven't had them in a long, long time. But you go back to the tech industry in the 80s, not uncommon. People knew about layoffs then, and there were periodic, downturns that encouraged layoffs, and it didn't really change the picture so much. But I think in terms of the dominance of today's crop of leading firms, sure, some of them are going to have problems, some of them are going to be disruptive, but it just seems I don't see evidence that there's any sort of turning of the tide here.
Okay, Jim, I want to come back again to some of the great questions that we're getting that are coming in from the audience. And again, if folks have more questions, we still have a little bit of time left, so we'll try to get to any additional ones that come in. So this is a question from Demetrius Zenos. Hi, Jim. Should these statistics influence the development of patent law to adjust its rules and standards in view of the observed objective evidence? And so the question is specific about patent law, but I think it's sort of more general around, sort of policy responses to what we're seeing.
Right. So I think the concern here is patent law may be contributing to the slowdown in mobility and changing of the diffusion of technology. Now, so it turns out, and this is another area where I spent some time in the past, if we're talking about software patents in particular, they have been a mess, and they are still a mess. They do still play a role where they can be used to discourage firms from entering certain markets, even though I should back up and explain what the mess is about. The mess is about we have all of these patents that have very vague boundaries. So it's very unclear what any particular patent covers. It's very unclear how I, as an innovator, can develop something that will not have a patent read on it. And that necessarily leads to litigation, and we've got some now good research showing that litigation reduces R&D and discourages firms and makes them leave certain markets. So I think you still have some of those things going on. I don't think patents are probably the biggest issue in terms of the lack of diffusion, but I think the overall picture is one. IP policy more generally, intellectual property, has always been to achieve a balance between incentives to create new ideas and incentives to spread those ideas. And I think sort of what the overall trends we're seeing is the diffusion part, the second part of spreading the ideas and spreading their use is suffering. And that says, for all of the complications of the system as a whole, we're out of balance. We've tilted too much to favoring inventors as opposed to favoring people developing secondary technologies or other new technologies. And so that says that the dial on a whole series of patent issues should be pulled back a little bit, and patent policy since the creation of the Federal Circuit in 1982 has tilted too far in the direction of favoring patent holders at the expense of other inventors.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here in terms of different policy responses to the problem that you laid out, right? Just to remind everybody, so we've talked about antitrust responses, we've talked about reforming the patent system, we've talked about data portability and interoperability, we've talked about increased training and maybe some apprenticeship and things like that. We've also talked about removing non-competes and things like that. Are there any other policy things that we should be considering, perhaps you raised in the book, or that you personally sort of care about, that we want to get out on the table in the last few minutes here?
Yeah, I think those are the main ones. Again, let me say, I don't know the complete policy answer. So there's a lot of room for other new ideas. This is a different problem that we faced. We've never faced it before, and like I said, I think it's going to take us a while to figure it all out, because we're talking about human changes in what people know, how people are trained, how they work together. These aren't things that are necessarily solved very easily, especially we're still figuring out exactly what's going on.
All right, so I'd like to kind of ask one final question, and that's about the book. And in particular, so when you started writing that book, was there one big question that you thought you were going to answer in the book, but ended up not being able to?
Well, I think there are a number of questions that I tried to answer in the book, and I don't think I fully answered. And I'm busy doing research now, trying to get to some of that. So, and that was one of these, this decision you have to make at a certain point. I see a lot of patterns. I see a lot of connected things. I don't quite understand how it all works together, but I can come up with some guesses. So, I think here's sort of one of the central dilemmas to me, which is, we see good evidence that there is a connection between software and growing industry concentration, declining disruption, but exactly how is that working? How does that happen? So in the book, I talked about John Sutton's models, which I think is a candidate explanation. I'm not convinced that's the only explanation, or maybe the main explanation. So I think there are big questions left on, just understanding the mechanisms of how this is working. And that the better we understand that, the better we'll be able to think about policy issues and whatever else. So that to me is the, sort of the one of the frontiers.
Fantastic. Thanks.
Great. Jim, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed the slides and the discussion. I have the book and I have started to read through it. So I look forward to finishing the book. So again, thank you very much, Jim. And thank you to everybody who joined our program today. The Center for the Future of Management will host Jim Wilson from Accenture in 2 weeks. He's going to be discussing his book titled How Radically Human Technology is Shaping the Future of Work. So we hope you all can join us for that. We will be in touch about that, as well as other events that we will be co-hosting in the spring via our mailing list. So please join our mailing list if you haven't had a chance to. Thank you all very much. Happy Thanksgiving to those of you that are celebrating. And we look forward to staying in touch with everybody. Thanks again, Jim.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
This has been fun.
Thanks, Jim. Cheers.